The Forsaken Alien Child. The cold metal halls of the Typhoran Royal Palace echoed with the whispers of disappointment. The great alien king, Varzok, stood before his people, his sharp golden eyes filled with disgust as he looked down at the tiny creature in the royal cradle. The child before him was his own daughter, his blood, but she was weak, fragile, and different from the strong warriors of his kind. "This thing," the king growled, "is no daughter of mine." The Xypherans were a mighty race, built for war, with thick armor-like skin and powerful muscles. But this child, she was small, her body delicate, her eyes too soft. She would never survive the harsh trials of their world. To keep her was shameful. "She will be cast out," the king declared. "No warrior will ever call her family." The queen, Sorvana, stood silent. In her heart, she felt sorrow, but she was bound by tradition. The Xyphoran Empire had no place for the weak. And so, the tiny princess was taken away. An unwanted child. The royal guards placed the child in an orphan station, a floating space station where unwanted children were left. The aliens in charge did not even give her a name. She was nothing. For years, she stayed there. No one wanted to adopt her. No alien race wanted a weak Xyphoran child. She was left alone, growing up in a cold place with nothing but the stars outside the window. The other children bullied her. "You are nothing. You are broken. You don't belong anywhere." She never spoke back. She just sat quietly, looking at the stars. Maybe somewhere, far away, there was a place where she did belong. But she never imagined that her fate would change until a human arrived. The arrival of Captain Eric Voss. The doors of the orphan station hissed open, and heavy boots echoed on the floor. A tall figure stepped in, wearing a dark pilot's jacket and carrying a small datapad. Captain Eric Voss. He was human, one of the few humans who still traveled this far into alien space. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, passing by all the alien children until they stopped on her. She sat alone in the corner, her tiny hands wrapped around her knees, her eyes dull and tired. The alien caretaker, a gray-skinned Drakmor, noticed Eric's interest and let out a low chuckle. "You don't want that one," the alien said. "She's weak. No race wanted her." Eric didn't answer immediately. He crouched down, looking at the little girl. She looked back at him, silent. "What's her name?" Eric asked. "She has no name," the caretaker said. "She was abandoned at birth. She is nothing." Eric frowned. He didn't like that word. Nothing. He reached out his hand. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "Do you want to come with me?" The little girl stared at his hand. No one had ever asked her before. No one had ever offered anything. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her small hand in his. And just like that, her life changed forever. The human who chose her. The moment Eric stepped out of the station with the child, the aliens around them started whispering. "A human is taking her. He must be insane. That child is cursed." But Eric ignored them. He carried her onto his ship, the Starfire, and set her down gently in one of the seats. She sat stiffly, not knowing what to do. She had never been inside a ship before. She had never belonged anywhere before. "What should I call you?" Eric asked. She didn't answer. She didn't have a name. Eric thought for a moment, then smiled. "How about Lena? Strong name. Simple." She blinked. A name. Her own name. "Lena. Lena," she said softly. "That's right," Eric said. "Lena. My daughter." Her heart stopped. Daughter? No one had ever called her that. No one had ever claimed her. Her small fingers clutched at the fabric of his jacket, afraid it was a dream. But Eric only smiled and ruffled her hair. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said. "You're with me now." The beginning of a new life. As the ship lifted off, leaving the orphan station behind, Lena watched through the window. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. For the first time in her life, she had a family. But deep in the shadows of space, the Typhoran Empire had already heard the news. The lost princess had been taken by a human, and they would not let that go unpunished. A human's promise. The hum of the ship's engines filled the quiet space. Inside the Starfire, Eric sat at the controls, glancing at the small figure curled up in the co-pilot's seat. The tiny alien girl, Lena, was fast asleep, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. She had barely spoken since they left the orphan station. It wasn't surprising. She had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, that no one wanted her, that she didn't belong anywhere. But Eric had chosen her. Now he just had to figure out how to be a father to an alien child. The first night, the ship drifted through the darkness of space, heading toward Eric's next stop, a neutral trade station where he could gather supplies. As he prepared to land, Lena stirred, her small fingers gripping the seat. Her glowing red eyes blinked open, confused. "We're stopping for supplies," Eric said, keeping his voice calm. "You hungry?" Lena hesitated, then nodded. "All right," Eric said, standing up. "Come on, kid." She followed him carefully, her small feet barely making a sound on the metal floors. Eric noticed how tense she was, how she kept her head low, as if expecting someone to scold her or push her away. She was afraid. That made his jaw tighten. Who in the galaxy could look at this kid and think she wasn't worth saving? A strange place. The trade station was busy, filled with different alien species. Huge reptilian merchants argued over cargo prices, insectoid creatures scuttled across the ceiling, and cybernetic traders exchanged data through glowing implants. Lena stuck close to Eric's side. She had never been in a place like this. The smells, the sounds, it was all overwhelming. But what made her heart pound the most were the stares. Aliens glanced at her, whispering to each other. Some sneered. Others looked at Eric like he was insane. Why would a human take an X-Cipher and reject? Someone muttered. She should have been left to die. Another voice whispered. Lena's small hands clenched. She knew these words. She had heard them before. Eric heard them too. He stopped walking, turning toward the crowd with a sharp glare. "You got something to say?" His voice was calm, but dangerous. The aliens went silent, turning away. No one wanted to challenge a human mercenary. Lena looked up at Eric, eyes wide. He had stood up for her. No one had ever done that before. First lesson. Stand tall. They entered a small food stall, and Eric ordered something simple, a plate of protein cubes and warm broth. Lena hesitated before taking a bite. To Eric's surprise, she ate carefully, silently, never wasting a single crumb. "You always eat like this?" Eric asked. Lena lowered her gaze. "Food was not always there," she said softly. Eric clenched his fist. The orphan station had starved her. "Well, kid, you don't have to worry about that anymore," Eric said. "From now on, you eat as much as you want." Lena looked up at him, eyes uncertain, as if testing his words. But when she saw the serious look on his face, she nodded. When they left the food stall, Eric noticed something. Lena was walking straighter. She was still small, still fragile, but she wasn't curling in on herself like before. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that she belonged with him. Danger in the dark. As they walked back toward the Starfire, Eric's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. The crowd around them had thinned. The air felt wrong. Then, out of the shadows, 3 figures stepped forward. Tall, armored, and unmistakably X-Cipheran. Royal Guards. Lena froze. Her breath hitched. She knew them. The leader, a scared warrior with glowing yellow eyes, stared at her with disgust. "So, the lost princess is still alive," he sneered. Lena stepped back, fear in her eyes. Eric stepped forward. "You got a problem?" he asked coldly. She is property of the Typhoran Empire. The warrior spat. She does not belong to a human. Hand her over. Eric's fingers tightened on his holster. His body was relaxed, but ready. She's not property, he said. She's my daughter. The warrior laughed. A human claiming a cipher in his family. That is a joke. Lena's heart pounded. She was terrified. But Eric, he was calm. You don't get to decide who my family is, Eric said. The warrior's face twisted in anger. He reached for his weapon. Big mistake. Eric Voss does not miss. Before the warrior could blink, Eric drew his blaster and fired. A clean shot, right through the alien's shoulder. He roared in pain, staggering backward. The other two guards lunged forward. But Eric was already moving. He grabbed Lena, twisting around, and kicking over a cargo crate to block their path. Then he bolted toward the Starfire. Hold on, kid, he muttered. Lena clung to his jacket as he weaved through the crowd. Behind them, the Kypheran warriors shouted in anger, but they were too slow. Eric reached the ship, slammed the controls, and the doors sealed shut. The Starfire lifted off just as blaster fire rang out, but Eric's ship was already disappearing into the dark sky. Inside, Lena was shaking. She had always been told that no one would fight for her, that she was nothing. But this human, he had risked everything for her. She looked up at him, eyes filled with questions. Why? Why do you protect me? She whispered. Eric exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then he crouched down to her level, looking her in the eyes. Because you're my kid, he said simply, and I protect what's mine. Lena felt something strange, something warm. For the first time in her life, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. The truth about Lena. The Starfire soared through the dark reaches of space, its engines humming steadily. Inside, Eric Voss sat at the pilot's seat, hands steady on the controls, his mind still sharp from the recent fight. His body carried the aches of battle, but that was normal. He was used to trouble. But this was different, because for the first time in years, he wasn't running alone. Lena sat across from him, curled up in the co-pilot's chair, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her oversized jacket. She had barely spoken since they escaped the Cypheran guards, but Eric could see the wheels turning in her head. She was afraid, not of him, of herself, and Eric was starting to realize why. The hidden strength. It started with small things. When they entered hyperspace, Lena barely blinked. Most kids got dizzy or disoriented the first time. Not her. She simply stared into the swirling blue tunnel of stars, her red eyes glowing faintly. Then there was the temperature issue. Kid, aren't you cold? Eric asked, frowning. The ship's heating was acting up, and even he could feel the chill in the air. Lena shook her head. I don't feel it. Eric paused. That wasn't normal. Even Cypherans had limits to how much cold they could take, but Lena felt nothing. And then came the most concerning moment of all. While Eric repaired a damaged panel in the engine room, Lena wandered closer, watching curiously. He barely noticed her, until his wrench slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. Before Eric could react, Lena reached for it, and the wrench floated up into her hand. The air around them pulsed. Eric felt a strange, electric charge in the room, like static before a storm. His heart stopped. Lena blinked in confusion, staring at the wrench in her hand. Then, as if realizing what she had just done, she dropped it instantly, stepping back in fear. I didn't. Her voice wavered. Eric exhaled slowly. His sharp mind was already putting the pieces together. The Typhoran Empire hadn't abandoned her because she was weak. They had abandoned her because she was too powerful. The secrets of the Typhoran Empire. Eric had spent years working in the outer rim of space. He knew things most people didn't. And right now, he was starting to realize exactly what Lena was. The Typherans were an ancient warrior race, but long ago, There was another kind among them. A bloodline of elites, powerful beyond imagination. They were different, faster, stronger, gifted with strange abilities. The Typhoran rulers feared them. So, the Empire had erased them. Or at least they had tried. And now, sitting in front of him, was living proof that they had failed. A child afraid of herself. Lena stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists. I don't know what's happening to me," she whispered. She looked so small, so scared, as if she believed she was some kind of monster. Eric crouched down beside her, his voice steady. "Hey, kid. It's okay." She shook her head. "No, it's not okay." She squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing quick and panicked. "I was never normal," she admitted. "Even at the orphan station, I could feel things. Sometimes, things moved when I wanted them to. But I was scared. If they knew, they would have." Her voice broke. Eric understood. They would have killed her. He took a deep breath. "Lena, listen to me. You're not dangerous. You're just different." Her red eyes locked onto his. "Then why did they abandon me?" Eric clenched his jaw. He knew why. Because the Typhoran royal family was afraid of her, afraid that if her power grew, she could challenge the throne itself. The bounty on her head. Eric didn't get much time to process everything. Because that's when the ship's warning alarms blared. Incoming hostile vessels. Eric snapped the controls, checking the radar. 3 ships were closing in fast. "Damn it," he muttered. Lena gripped the edge of her seat. "What's happening?" "Bounty hunters," Eric growled. "Looks like someone put a price on you, kid." His gut told him exactly who had put the bounty out. The Typhoran royal family wanted her dead. Dogfight in the stars. The enemy ships opened fire. Blaster bolts ripped through space, barely missing the starfire. Eric yanked the controls, sending the ship into a sharp dive. Lena clutched the seat, eyes wide. "Are they going to kill us?" Eric grinned. "Not today." The starfire twisted and rolled, dodging the enemy shots with sharp precision. Eric's hands moved smoothly over the controls. This was his element. But 3 ships against 1. The odds were bad. One of the enemy ships scored a hit, and the starfire shuddered violently. Smoke filled the cockpit. Lena gasped. "We're hit." Eric gritted his teeth. "Yeah, I noticed." The ship spun out of control, but then the air inside the cockpit shifted. A strange energy pulsed in the room. Eric felt it. And when he turned to Lena, her eyes were glowing. Lena's awakening. Time slowed. The damaged systems of the ship suddenly flickered back to life. The air around Lena crackled with power. Eric could feel the charge. Something ancient, something untamed. Lena reached out, and for a brief moment, the entire ship moved as if it were an extension of her. Eric didn't know how, but suddenly, the starfire corrected its spin. It was as if Lena had willed it back into control. Her powers weren't just strong, they were evolving. But there was no time to think about it. Eric grabbed the controls, took advantage of the moment, and fired 2 precise shots. 2 of the enemy ships exploded instantly. The last bounty hunter panicked and fled. And just like that, the fight was over. The cockpit fell silent, except for Lena's shaky breath. She stared down at her hands, eyes wide with fear and confusion. I didn't mean to." Eric looked at her for a long moment. Then he sighed and leaned back. "Well, kid," he said, "looks like we got a lot to talk about." The betrayal. The starfire drifted in the darkness of deep space, its engines running quietly. Inside the cockpit, Eric Voss leaned against the control panel, watching the endless stars stretch out before him. Beside him, Lena sat still, staring at her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly. She had done something impossible. She had moved the ship, not with her hands, not with the controls, but with something inside her. She had felt it. The raw energy, the strange power, the invisible force that had surged through her body, and for a few moments she had controlled it. But it scared her. "Captain." Her voice was small, hesitant. Eric turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah." Lena swallowed hard. "Am I a monster?" That question made Eric's jaw tighten. He sighed and rubbed his temples. "You're not a monster, kid," he said firmly. "You're just different." She looked up at him, searching his face for some kind of reassurance. "Then why do they want me dead?" Eric exhaled. That was the question he had been avoiding. He didn't know all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. The HFY royal family had put a bounty on her head. They were afraid of her. And Eric had spent enough years in this galaxy to know what fear led to. They weren't just trying to get rid of her. They were trying to erase her from history. A meeting with the warlord. They needed information. They needed a plan. And most of all, they needed allies. Eric knew just the place to start. The Syndralis Market was a floating black market station hidden in the asteroid belts of the Corin system. It was where smugglers, bounty hunters, and warlords did business. It was also where Eric's old friend held power. As the Starfire docked, Lena peered out of the window, eyes wide. The station was a chaotic mess of neon lights, rusted platforms, and crowded streets filled with aliens of every shape and size. It smelled of engine oil, burnt spices, and secrets. Lena hesitated. Are we safe here?" Eric smirked. "No, but we're safer than most." He led her through the bustling crowds, past merchant stands selling illegal weapons, rare alien tech, and exotic creatures in cages. The deeper they walked, the darker it got. Finally, they reached a large metal door guarded by two heavily armed soldiers. Eric stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Tell your boss that Eric Voss is here." The guards exchanged looks before nodding and opening the doors. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the scent of blood. At the center of the room sat Warlord Korak, a towering figure with black cybernetic implants covering half his face. Korak was once a human. But after decades of warfare and augmentation, he was more machine than man. His cold, artificial eye glowed red as he looked up from his throne of metal and bones. A slow grin spread across his scared face. Well, Korak rumbled. "If it isn't the infamous Captain Voss." Eric crossed his arms. "Long time, Korak." Korak's gaze shifted to Lena. His grin widened. "And what's this? A little Cypheran princess in your care." "Eric, you always did have a talent for picking up strays." Lena shrank back slightly, but Eric placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "She's with me," he said coolly. Korak chuckled. "I figured. Word travels fast, my friend. The bounty on her head is high. Very high." Eric's jaw tightened. "Then you know why I'm here." The warlord leaned back, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "You want information. You want to know why the Cypherans want her dead." Eric nodded. Korak smirked. "And what makes you think I'd give that information for free?" The betrayal. Eric had been expecting this. He had worked with Korak before. A deal was never just a deal. "What do you want?" Eric asked, already dreading the answer. Korak leaned forward, his mechanical eye flickering. "A simple trade." Then his voice turned cold. "You give me the girl, and I let you live." Silence. Lena's breath hitched. Eric didn't even blink. His expression stayed calm, but inside, rage boiled in his chest. "I'm not selling her, Korak." The warlord sighed dramatically. "Pity." Then he snapped his fingers. The guards moved instantly. Before Eric could react, 4 soldiers grabbed him, shoving him down and locking his arms behind his back. Lena cried out, stepping back in panic. "Eric." But another guard grabbed her, dragging her toward Korak's throne. She struggled, but she was too small, too weak. Korak smirked as he stood, towering over her. "You have no idea what you are, little princess," he said, gripping her chin. "The Cypheran king wants you erased, but me. I see potential." His cybernetic fingers pressed against her skin, cold and cruel. Lena froze. A deep, terrible fear clawed at her chest. For the first time, she realized that maybe Eric couldn't protect her. Maybe she really was alone. Eric's escape. But Eric Voss was not a man to be underestimated. With a sharp twist of his body, he slammed his elbow into the nearest guard's throat. The soldier gasped, staggering back. And that was all Eric needed. In one smooth motion, he ripped a blaster from a fallen guard's holster and fired. The room exploded into chaos. Eric spun, knocking out another guard, dodging the swing from behind. Adrenaline fueled his every move. Lena stared in shock. Then she saw it. One of the guards was aiming at Eric. Lena's heart raced. Something inside her snapped. And suddenly, the entire room trembled. A powerful shockwave burst from her tiny body, sending the guards flying backward. Korak's cybernetic systems flickered wildly, and the very walls of the chamber cracked. Eric felt it too. That same strange, invisible energy. But this time, it was stronger. Lena's power was growing. Korak staggered back, eyes wide. "What are you?" he whispered. Lena's breathing was ragged. Her small fists were clenched. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just running. She was fighting back. The great escape. Eric grabbed Lena's hand. "We're leaving." Now, with Lena's powers still disrupting the room, they'd fought their way through the corridors, dodging gunfire and alarms. They reached the Starfire just as more soldiers swarmed the docking bay. Eric lifted Lena into the ship and slammed the controls. The Starfire's engines roared to life, and within seconds, they were blasting out of the station. As they escaped into the dark void of space, Eric finally turned to Lena. "You okay, kid?" Lena, still trembling from what she had done, whispered one sentence. "I don't think I'm normal." Eric exhaled, staring at her. "No, kid," he muttered. "You're something else." Lena's awakening. The Starfire shot through the vast emptiness of space, leaving the burning wreckage of Cinderella's market behind. The ship's alarms blared, warning of critical damage. Smoke filled the air, sparks flickered from broken circuits, and the entire cockpit shook violently as Eric struggled to keep the ship stable. Lena sat in the co-pilot's seat, her small hands clenched into fists. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding. She had done something terrible. She had lost control. And when she did, everything around her broke. The aftermath of power. Eric gritted his teeth as he steered the ship toward a remote asteroid field, hoping to lose any bounty hunters still tracking them. He didn't speak at first. His mind was racing, piecing together everything that had just happened. Lena, meanwhile, sat completely still. Her fingers trembled. The shock of her own actions was still fresh in her mind. She had felt it. That power inside her. It wasn't just strength. It was something ancient, raw, and terrifying. She had barely touched it, yet it had exploded out of her like a storm. And the worst part, it had felt good. Eric finally broke the silence. "All right, kid," he said, voice low. "We need to talk." Lena flinched slightly. She could hear the tension in his voice. She knew he was angry. Not at her. At what she was becoming. She looked down at her hands. "What am I?" "A hidden legacy." Eric turned to face her, arms crossed. "Back at the warlord's den, you unleashed something. You nearly brought the entire damn place down. I need you to be honest with me, Lena. Have you ever done that before?" Lena swallowed hard. "And not like that," she admitted. "But I've always felt it inside me. I just never knew what it was." Eric nodded slowly, thinking. He had fought Cypherans before. He had studied their empire. But nothing in their history ever mentioned this kind of ability. Unless a memory surfaced. A rumor he once heard in a deep space bar, years ago. The lost lineage. Long ago, there had been a different bloodline within the Cypheran royal family. Not warriors, but something else. Something greater. They were said to have abilities beyond normal understanding. They could bend energy, influence matter, and control the very forces around them. But they were considered too dangerous. So the Cypheran Empire wiped them out. Or at least, they thought they did. Eric looked at Lena carefully. Could she be the last of them? Lena, he said slowly, what if you're not just a princess? What if you're something older? Lena shivered. You mean, that's why they abandoned me? Eric nodded. They weren't afraid of your weakness. They were afraid of what you've become. Lena's fingers dug into her arms. Fear, shame, confusion. All her life, she had been told she was worthless. A mistake, a failure. But the truth was even worse. She wasn't worthless. She was dangerous. Hunted once more. Before Eric could say anything else, the ship's alarms screamed. War Arning. In Kyo main hostiles. Eric spun to the controls. 3 ships were closing in fast. Lena tensed. Bounty hunters. Worse, Eric muttered. He tapped a few buttons, zooming in on the ship IDs. The insignia on the approaching vessels sent a chill down his spine. Cypheran Royal Fleet. Lena's breath hitched. They found me. Eric didn't hesitate. Buckle up, kid. The enemy ships opened fire. Blaster shots ripped through space, forcing Eric to dive the Starfire into a series of tight evasive maneuvers. Metal groaned under the strain as the ship spun through the asteroid field, dodging massive floating rocks and debris. Lena gripped the sides of her seat. The panic rose inside her. The same panic that had awakened her power before. She couldn't lose control. Not again. But the enemy ships were too fast. One of them locked onto the Starfire, and a glowing plasma torpedo launched straight toward them. Lena felt it before she saw it. An invisible pulse inside her chest. A warning. Time seemed to slow. The torpedo drew closer. Eric's hands flew across the controls, but he knew they wouldn't escape in time. And then, Lena reached out. She didn't know why. She didn't know how. But something inside her reacted, and in an instant, the torpedo stopped. Suspended in midair. Eric's eyes widened. Lena. Before he could finish, Lena let out a sharp breath. And the torpedo reversed direction. It raced backward, slamming straight into the enemy ship that had fired it. The explosion lit up the darkness as the vessel was ripped apart. The remaining 2 ships hesitated. For the first time, they were afraid. A new side of Lena. Lena gasped, slumping in her seat. Her heart pounded, sweat dripping down her forehead. What had she just done? She had felt the torpedo's energy, the pull of its force, and somehow, she had turned it back. Eric quickly took control of the situation, diving the Starfire through the asteroid field. The 2 remaining ships didn't follow. They had seen enough. By the time they cleared the asteroid belt, the Cypheran ships had retreated. For now. Inside the cockpit, Lena sat in stunned silence. Eric finally exhaled, rubbing his face. Well, he muttered, that just happened. Lena's hands shook. She didn't know whether to be terrified or excited. She turned to Eric. I don't understand. What am I? Eric's expression was unreadable. You're something the galaxy hasn't seen in a long time, kid. Lena swallowed. Is that a good thing? Eric sighed, staring out at the endless stretch of space ahead of them. I guess we're about to find out. War against the Empire. The Starfire floated in the endless void of space, hidden deep within the shattered remains of an ancient moon. The ship's hull was scorched from battle, its engines running low on power. Inside, the tension was thick. Eric Voss sat at the controls, silent. His hands were steady, but his mind was anything but. Lena sat across from him, curled up in her seat, staring at the floor. Neither of them spoke. Because the truth was now undeniable. Lena was not just a lost princess. She was something more. Something feared. And the Typhoran Empire would never stop hunting her. The call for war. The silence was broken by an incoming transmission. A deep voice crackled through the speakers. "Voss, I hear you've stirred up quite the mess." Eric smirked. Wouldn't be the first time. On the holoscreen, a large figure appeared. General Kalos, an exiled Cyphoran warlord. Kalos had once been a great commander in the royal fleet, but he had turned against the Empire when he saw their cruelty. Now he led a growing rebellion, a scattered group of fighters made up of humans, exiled Cypherans, and outcasts from across the galaxy. "I heard rumors," Kalos said, his reptilian eyes narrowing. "They say the Empire is desperate to erase something. Something they fear." His gaze shifted to Lena. "She's the reason, isn't she?" Lena tensed. Eric didn't answer. Kalos exhaled. "I need to meet her. If the Empire fears her, then she might be the key to ending this war. A dangerous alliance." Eric set a course for the rebel stronghold. It was hidden in a dying star system, a massive base built inside the hollow remains of a broken planet. The moment they arrived, dozens of ships surrounded them. Fighters, bombers, and battle-worn cruisers. The rebellion was stronger than Eric expected. Inside the war room, Kalos waited. The general stood tall, his armor battle-scarred, his presence commanding. His soldiers flanked him, watching Lena with cautious eyes. Eric kept her close. He trusted no one. Kalos studied her. Then he finally spoke. "You are not just a princess," he said. "You are the last of the ancient bloodline." Lena's breath caught. "The what?" Kalos glanced at Eric, as if checking to see how much she knew. Eric gave nothing away. So Kalos continued. "Long ago, before the Empire, your ancestors ruled not with war, but with power. True power. They could control the very forces of the universe. The Typhoran kings feared them. So they were erased." His voice darkened. Or so they thought. Lena took a step back, shaking her head. "No, I can't be." Kalos knelt before her, his voice softer now. "You are proof that they failed." Lena's heart pounded. She had spent her whole life believing she was nothing. Now she was being told she was the key to a war. She wasn't ready for this. But the galaxy didn't care. The Empire strikes first. Before Lena could process the truth, alarms blared across the base. An officer rushed in, panic in his voice. "General, the Empire has found us." Kalos cursed. He turned to Eric. "You led them here." Eric's eyes flashed with anger. "No, but I sure as hell am gonna help get us out." Lena barely had time to react before the entire base shook. The Empire's fleet had arrived. The battle begins. Explosions rocked the underground base. The rebel stronghold was under siege. The war room erupted into chaos as soldiers rushed to their stations. Kalos barked orders, calling for fighters to scramble. Outside, in the darkness of space, a massive Typhoran fleet loomed. Dozens of warships. Thousands of soldiers. At the center of it all, aboard the command ship, sat the Cypheran king. He had come to end this himself. Lena stood frozen as the ground trembled beneath her, her fingers curled into fists. The Empire had chased her since the day she was born. And now they had finally come for her. Lena's choice. Eric grabbed her arm. "We have to go." But Lena didn't move. She looked at the chaos unfolding. The rebels were fighting for their lives. The Typhoran fleet was destroying everything. And she felt it again. That same energy. That same power inside her. She wasn't just running anymore. She was done hiding. Lena turned to Eric. Her voice was steady. "I have to fight." Eric's stomach tightened. He had been afraid she would say that. "You don't have to prove anything, kid," he said. "We can run." Lena shook her head. "I'm not running anymore." Eric cursed under his breath. but there was no fear in her eyes. Just determination. She turned to Kalos. "Get me on that command ship." Kalos stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. Infiltrating the enemy. While the battle raged outside, Lena, Eric, and a small team of elite rebels boarded a stolen Cypheran ship. Disguised as soldiers, they slipped past enemy lines, heading straight for the heart of the Empire's fleet. The plan was simple. Lena had to face the king. And this time, she wasn't going to bow. The final confrontation. The command ship's throne room was cold and dark. At the center, sitting on a raised platform of polished black metal, was the Typhoran king. He was larger than any warrior Lena had seen, his armor gleaming like a predator waiting for the kill. His golden eyes locked onto her the moment she stepped inside. "So," he rumbled, "the lost princess returns." Lena's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. The king's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I should have had you executed the moment you were born." Lena lifted her chin. "You tried." The air crackled around her. Something inside her shifted, and the king felt it. For the first time in his life, that Cypheran king hesitated. The beginning of the end. Lena took a deep breath, closing her eyes. She could feel it now. The power of her ancestors, the strength they tried to erase. She was not nothing. She was everything they feared. Lena's eyes snapped open, and the room exploded with power. The war for the galaxy had begun. The chosen princess. The throne room trembled. Power crackled through the air, thick and heavy like an approaching storm. The Cypheran king stood at the top of the obsidian steps, his golden eyes locked onto the small figure standing before him. Lena. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't afraid. For the first time in her life, she stood with her chin high, her eyes blazing with an inner fire that even the mighty emperor of the Typherans could not ignore. The guards surrounding the king hesitated. They could feel it too. Something ancient, something stronger than any warrior in the Empire's history, and it was coming from her. The king's challenge. The king's expression hardened. "You think your blood makes you strong," he growled. "You are nothing but a mistake. A child that should have been erased before she could crawl." His voice was like thunder, but it no longer shook her. Lena took a step forward. "You were afraid of me the moment I was born," she said, her voice steady. "That's why you abandoned me. That's why you hunted me." She clenched her fists, the energy in her veins pulsing. "But I'm still here." The king's eyes narrowed. "You stand before me like a warrior. Do you wish to claim your place?" Lena lifted her chin. "I wish to end your rule." The throne room fell into silence. Then the king laughed, a deep, rumbling sound filled with mockery. He raised one armored hand and gestured for his warriors to attack. "Kill her," he commanded. The last battle. The moment the first warrior charged, Lena moved. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. The energy inside her exploded. A force unlike anything ever seen before rippled through the air. The first Cypheran warrior was sent flying across the room, crashing into a pillar with bone-breaking force. Another lunged, blade drawn, but Lena caught his wrist in midair, twisting with inhuman speed and sending him to the ground with a single motion. The third tried to fire a plasma rifle, but Lena lifted her hand, and the weapon was ripped from his grasp, floating into the air before turning and firing directly at him. The guards fell like shadows before the light. One by one, she was unstoppable. Eric's last stand. Outside the throne room, chaos reigned. The rebel fleet had launched a full-scale assault on the Cypheran armada. Massive warships clashed, engines roaring as blaster fire tore through space. Fighters spun through the battlefield, evading enemy fire, battling for survival. And in the middle of it all, Eric Voss was fighting for his life. With a blaster in one hand and a stolen Cypheran blade in the other, he carved his way through the enemy forces, his body moving like a well-tuned machine. A soldier aimed at him from behind. Eric ducked, spun, and fired. A clean shot, straight to the heart. A second soldier lunged. Eric's blade flashed, cutting through armor like paper. But there were too many. For every warrior he struck down, 3 more took their place, and he was running out of time. He glanced at his communicator. "Lena, whatever you're doing in there, do it fast." Lena versus the king. Inside the throne room, Lena faced the king. The warriors had fallen. It was just them now. The king stepped forward, removing his heavy cloak. His armor shifted, expanding, revealing hidden weapons built into his gauntlets. "I see now," he said. "You are no weakling." He rolled his shoulders, preparing for battle. "You are a challenge." Lena exhaled. She felt it. The moment she had been running from her entire life. The moment when she had to decide who she really was. She wasn't just an abandoned child. She wasn't just an orphan raised by a human. She was the last of the ancient bloodline. The king charged. Lena met him head-on. The clash of titans. The battle was fierce. The king was fast, but Lena was faster. He was strong, but Lena was stronger. Every strike he threw, she countered. Every attack he launched, she dodged. But he was not just a warrior. He was the ruler of the Typhorans. And he had trained for war his entire life. A sudden explosive punch caught Lena off guard. She skidded across the floor, gasping for breath. The king loomed over her, blade in hand. "You have power," he admitted. "But power is nothing without control." He raised his sword, ready to end it. Lena's final stand. But Lena wasn't done. She closed her eyes. She felt the power inside her. And this time, she didn't hold back. The entire room trembled. A shockwave ripped through the air. Lena opened her eyes, and they were glowing like burning stars. The king hesitated. And in that split second, Lena moved. Faster than light. She grasped the king's wrist, twisted, and with a final, earth-shattering burst of power, she slammed him into the ground. The impact cracked the throne room floor. The king did not rise. The fall of the empire. Outside, the battle in space shifted. The moment the king fell, the Typhoran fleet hesitated. Then, the rebel flagship gave the command. "Advance. The king is down." And just like that, the empire collapsed. Ships fled. Generals surrendered. And the war was over. A new beginning. The throne room was silent. Lena stood over the fallen king, her chest rising and falling. She had won. Eric stumbled into the room, blood on his hands, his jacket torn. He looked at the scene, then exhaled in relief. "Damn kid," he muttered. "You really did it." Lena turned to him, eyes still glowing. "I don't want the throne," she said. "I don't want to rule." Eric smirked. "Good. Ruling is boring." Lena looked down at the king one last time. "But I'll make sure no one else rules like him ever again." She turned away. And for the first time in her life, she walked toward the future, not the past. Epilogue. The legend of the lost princess. The war ended that day. The Typhoran Empire fell. The rebels rose. And Lena's name was written into history. Some called her a warrior. Some called her a savior. But those who truly knew her, they called her something else. They called her family. The end.